February 1942, a blind Japanese soldier, captured in New Guinea, waited for the Australian bullet that never came instead. He was given a hospital bed, clean sheets, and more food than he'd seen in months of fighting for the Emperor. He'd been taught that surrender meant torture and death, that the enemy were savage barbarians who would mutilate prisoners without mercy. But if Australia was supposed to be the inferior nation destined to fall before Japan's divine empire, why were disabled Japanese POWs eating better, healing faster, and being fitted with prosthetic limbs while their own countrymen starved? To understand how he arrived at this moment, we need to go back just months earlier. The Pacific War had exploded across Asia like a wildfire no one could control. Singapore, the great fortress city that Britain promised could never fall, had fallen in just 7 days. Darwin, a quiet port town in northern Australia, had been bombed so heavily that the harbour burned for weeks. Across the islands of the Pacific, Japanese soldiers pushed forward with terrifying speed, island after island, victory after victory. They believed they were unstoppable. They believed they were chosen by heaven itself to rule. But beneath all that confidence and all those battle flags lived a belief even stronger than their faith in victory. It was a belief that shaped every Japanese soldier from the moment they put on their uniform. Surrender was not an option. Surrender was worse than death. Surrender meant you were no longer a man, no longer worthy of respect, no longer worthy of life itself. This was Bushido, the ancient warrior code that every Japanese soldier carried in their heart. It told them that to be captured was to become something shameful, something broken, something that should not exist. They were taught this in training camps, where drill sergeants screamed it into their faces. They were taught this in propaganda films, shown in darkened theatres where enemy soldiers were drawn as monsters with fangs and claws. They were taught this in letters from home, where mothers wrote that death in battle was the greatest honour a son could bring to his family. The message was clear, and it was repeated so many times that it became truth. If you are captured, the enemy will torture you. They will cut off your fingers one by one. They will blind you. They will make you beg for death. Better to die fighting. Better to pull the pin on your last grenade and take enemies with you. Better to charge into machine gun fire than to raise your hands in surrender. In this world of iron discipline and unshakable belief, there were thousands of young men fighting across the jungles of New Guinea and the scattered islands of the Solomon Chain. They fought in places where the heat was so thick you could barely breathe, where mosquitoes brought diseases that killed as many men as bullets, where the jungle itself seemed to be trying to swallow you whole. Among these soldiers were men who would soon learn that everything they believed was a lie, but they did not know this yet. Right now, in early 1942, they were still convinced of their superiority. They had been told that Japan's empire would stretch from India to Hawaii, that the white races were weak and lazy, that Asian people were destined to throw off Western chains and unite under Japanese leadership. They believed it because everyone around them believed it. They believed it because questioning it was dangerous. They believed it because they had never seen anything that proved otherwise. Then the battles began to turn, slowly at first, then faster. By 1943, Australian forces were pushing back in New Guinea. American Marines were island hopping across the Pacific. The Japanese supply lines, stretched so thin across thousands of miles of ocean, began to snap. Soldiers who once ate rice and fish now ate roots and bugs. Soldiers who once had medicine now died from infections that could have been cured with a single pill. And soldiers who once never thought about surrender began to face a terrible choice: die slowly from starvation and disease in the jungle, or face capture and whatever horrors that might bring. One of these soldiers was a young man who had been blinded near the town of Buna when a grenade exploded too close to his foxhole. The blast took his sight, but left him alive, stumbling through the jungle, hands stretched out in front of him, calling for his unit. No one answered. He was alone. He could hear gunfire in the distance growing fainter. He knew what this meant. His unit had retreated or been wiped out. He sat down against a tree and waited. He expected death would come soon, either from the jungle or from enemy soldiers. Part of him hoped it would be quick. He thought about his family back home, about his mother who had been so proud when he enlisted, about his younger sister who had made him promise to come back. He knew now he would never see them again. He could not see anything ever again. Then he heard boots crunching through the underbrush. Foreign voices speaking a language he did not understand, but recognized as English Australian soldiers. His heart hammered in his chest. This was the moment. This was where he would die. He thought about reaching for his rifle, but realized he had lost it somewhere in his blind stumbling. He had no weapon. He could not see. He could not run. He could only sit and wait for the bullet. The footsteps came closer. He heard someone gasp, heard rapid conversation, heard more boots approaching. He braced himself. This was the end. Better to die than to face what they would do to him. But the bullet never came. Instead, he felt hands on his shoulders, gentle hands, and a voice speaking slowly in broken Japanese. Daijobu, Daijobu. You are safe now. The words made no sense. Safe? How could he be safe? He was captured. He was blind. He was finished. But the hands kept touching him carefully, checking his wounds, wrapping something soft around his head, a bandage. They were bandaging him. An Australian medic knelt beside him and offered him water from a canteen. The blind soldier's hands shook as he reached for it. He expected it to be poison or some kind of trick. But the water was clean and cool and the most wonderful thing he had ever tasted. He drank and drank until the medic gently pulled the canteen away. Easy, mate, the medic said in English. Easy. They lifted him onto a stretcher and carried him through the jungle. He could not see where they were taking him, but he could hear them talking, could hear the concern in their voices. Not anger, not hatred, just professional worry, like doctors discussing a patient. This confused him more than anything. Where was the torture? Where was the cruelty? Where were the monsters from the propaganda films? Instead, there were just men carrying him carefully through difficult terrain, making sure not to jostle his wounds. They took him to a prisoner of war camp deep in the Australian countryside, a place far from the fighting, far from the jungle, far from everything he knew. When they carried him into the hospital ward, he felt something soft beneath him. A mattress. A real mattress with springs and padding, not the thin rice mats he had slept on in the jungle or even back at the barracks in Japan. There were sheets too, clean sheets that smelled like soap, and something he had never expected in a million years, a pillow. He touched it with trembling fingers, feeling the cotton fabric, the soft stuffing inside. In the Japanese army, only officers had pillows. Regular soldiers bundled up their uniforms or used their packs. But here, even a captured enemy soldier, even a blind and useless prisoner, was given a pillow. The Australian doctor who examined him spoke no Japanese, but his hands were steady and sure. He checked the bandages around the soldier's eyes, changed them carefully, applied some kind of ointment that stung but then felt cool and soothing. The doctor made notes on a clipboard, spoke to a nurse in that strange English language that sounded so different from Japanese, so loose and casual. The blind soldier waited for pain, for deliberate cruelty disguised as medical care. It never came. The doctor finished his examination, patted the soldier's shoulder twice, and moved on to the next bed. That was it. No torture, no humiliation. Just medical care, the same kind of care the soldier imagined Australian soldiers received. The next shock came at mealtime. A nurse brought him a tray and guided his hands to show him where everything was placed. On the left, a plate of meat. Real meat, beef, more meat than he had seen in 6 months of jungle fighting. He picked it up with his fingers, smelled it, could not believe it was real. There was bread too, soft white bread with butter. Vegetables that were fresh, not rotting, not picked from the jungle and half poisonous. The nurse told him something in English, and even though he could not understand the words, he understood the tone. Eat. It is for you. He ate slowly at first, afraid it was a trick, afraid it would be taken away, but no one took it away. He finished everything on the plate, and they brought him more. Later, he would learn the exact numbers. Each prisoner received 680 grams of meat per week, fresh bread every day, vegetables from Australian farms. And because he was disabled, because he was blind and still recovering, he received extra rations. Milk every morning, eggs twice a week, fruit when it was available. He thought about his unit in the jungle. Men so hungry they ate tree bark. Men who fought each other over a single tin of fish. Men whose teeth fell out from lack of vitamins. He thought about civilians back in Japan who were already facing shortages, already growing thin, already learning to eat sweet potato vines and acorn flour because the rice was being sent to the army. And here he was, a captured enemy, eating better than Japanese frontline soldiers at the height of their power. It made no sense. Nothing made sense anymore. In another part of the camp, a Japanese officer who had lost both legs in an artillery strike was wheeled into a workshop. He had been a proud man once, a graduate of military academy, a believer in Japanese superiority and the divine right of the emperor. Now he sat in a wheelchair, useless, expecting to be treated like garbage. Instead, the Australians gave him a job. They taught him to work with his hands, to operate simple machines, to feel useful again. He watched Australian guards working alongside him, men who laughed and joked while they worked, who seemed to have no shortage of anything. The metal they used was high quality, not the substitute materials Japan had been forced to use since the war began. The tools were well maintained, oiled, sharp, ready, everything worked. Nothing was broken or patched together or held with wire and prayer. The officer learned that the Australians were making artificial limbs right here in the camp. Prosthetic legs and arms for disabled Japanese prisoners. He could not believe it at first. Why would they waste resources on enemies? Why would they care if a Japanese soldier could walk again? But they did care. Between 1943 and 1945, the workshop produced 43 artificial legs and arms. 43. Each one carefully measured and fitted to the individual prisoner who would wear it. The officer received a prosthetic leg made from Australian wood and metal, fitted by an Australian craftsman who took pride in his work, who adjusted it 3 times until it was comfortable, who showed the officer how to strap it on and care for the leather straps. One prisoner, a young soldier who had lost his right arm to shrapnel, was struggling to learn to write with his left hand. His characters were shaky and childlike, nothing like the beautiful calligraphy he had been taught in school. An Australian guard noticed him practicing, watched for a few days without saying anything. Then one morning, the guard brought him a stack of paper. Good paper, not scraps or recycled newspaper, but actual writing paper. The prisoner bowed his head, confused and grateful. A week later, the guard brought something else. School notebooks that had belonged to his daughter, pages filled with English words and arithmetic problems, but plenty of blank pages left in the back. The guard mimed writing, pointed at the prisoner, smiled. Practice. Get better. The prisoner held those notebooks like they were made of gold. Why would an enemy help him? Why would a man whose country was at war with Japan care if a Japanese soldier could write again? At night, when the lights went out and the guards were fewer, the prisoners whispered among themselves. Some clung to the old beliefs, like drowning men clinging to driftwood. This is a trick, they said. They are making us soft for propaganda purposes. They will take photographs of us looking healthy and use them to demoralize our troops. They will torture us later when the cameras are gone. But these explanations sounded weaker every day. Other prisoners began to voice doubts they would never have dared speak before. One amputee, a farmer's son from Hokkaido, said quietly in the darkness, "If we are the superior race, if we are destined to rule Asia, why do the Australians have so much? Why are their soldiers well fed while ours starve? Why do they have medicine while our men die from infections? Why do they waste resources making artificial legs for enemies while we cannot even supply our own troops?" No one answered him, but everyone heard the question. It hung in the air like smoke, drifting from bed to bed, settling into minds that had never questioned before. The blind soldier lay awake, feeling the pillow beneath his head, remembering the meat he had eaten, thinking about the careful hands of the Australian doctor. He had been taught that Australians were barbarians, that white people were weak and decadent, that Japan's strength came from its purity and discipline. But if that was true, why did everything here suggest the opposite? Nearly 3 years into his captivity, something happened that would break whatever certainty remained. December 25th, 1944, Christmas. The blind soldier did not know what Christmas was, not really. He knew it was some kind of foreign holiday that Christians celebrated, something about a baby and a star. But the details meant nothing to him. What he did know was that something different was happening in the camp. He could hear it in the voices of the guards. Excitement and happiness that seemed to fill the air like electricity. He could smell it too, smells coming from the kitchen that made his stomach rumble even though he had eaten breakfast only a few hours ago. Roasting meat, baking bread, something sweet and spicy that he could not identify. When they came to get the disabled prisoners for lunch, the blind soldier expected the usual routine. Someone would guide him to the dining hall, sit him at a table, bring him his tray. But today felt different. There were more people moving around, more voices, more laughter. Someone took his arm gently and led him to a seat. He heard the scrape of chairs, the rustle of many people sitting down together. Then the trays arrived, and the blind soldier reached out carefully to feel what was there. His fingers touched meat, hot meat, so much meat that it covered half the plate. Roast beef, someone near him whispered in Japanese, their voice full of wonder. There were potatoes too, soft and buttery, and something thick and rich that he learned was called gravy, bread with butter. Vegetables cooked until they were tender, and then, impossibly, dessert. Something dense and sweet and studded with fruit. Plum pudding, the whisper came again. The blind soldier began to eat and could not stop. The flavors overwhelmed him. The quantity overwhelmed him. He ate until his stomach hurt, until he thought he might be sick, and still there was food left on his plate. Around him he heard other prisoners eating with the same desperate intensity, men who had known hunger for so long that abundance felt like a dream they might wake from at any moment. Someone opened bottles, and the smell of beer filled the air. They were giving the prisoners beer. Not sack, which the blind soldier would have recognized, but Australian beer, bitter and cold and carbonated in a way that tickled his nose. He sipped it carefully, felt it go to his head almost immediately, because his body was not used to alcohol anymore. Later, when someone helped him count the food, he learned he had eaten more than 1,200 calories in that single meal. 1,200 calories. More than he had consumed in some entire weeks in the jungle. More than many Japanese civilians were eating in a whole day back home, where rationing had turned meals into tiny portions of vegetables and grain, where children grew up stunted and weak, where old people simply lay down and died because there was not enough food to go around. And here, in a prisoner of war camp, on enemy soil, a blind Japanese soldier had just eaten like a rich man, like royalty, like someone who mattered. But what broke something inside him was not just the food. It was where he was eating it. The blind soldier could hear Australian guards sitting at the same tables, eating the same meal, talking and laughing with each other. Not in a separate room. Not at a raised platform looking down on the prisoners. Right there, alongside the men they guarded, sharing the same Christmas dinner, as if this was normal, as if enemies could sit together and eat together and be human together. One guard, the one who always spoke kindly when he brought medicine, sat down next to the blind soldier and said something in English. The soldier did not understand the words, but he understood when the guard clinked his beer bottle against the soldier's in a toast. Cheers, mate. Merry Christmas. The blind soldier sat very still, his unseeing eyes pointed at nothing, his hands resting on the table. Inside his head, something was crumbling. All the propaganda he had believed, all the promises of Japanese superiority, all the certainty that had carried him through training and battle and capture. It was falling apart like a sand castle hit by a wave. If Japan was destined to rule the world, why were its soldiers starving? If the emperor was divine and his cause was just, why did the gods allow this? Why were the enemies prosperous while the chosen people suffered? Why were barbarians showing more humanity than the civilized? The questions multiplied in his mind like cracks spreading through ice, each one making the whole structure weaker until he did not know what he believed anymore. In the workshop, the officer with the prosthetic legs was learning carpentry. At first, he had resisted, had thought it beneath his dignity to work with his hands like a common labourer. But the Australians did not care about his rank or his pride. They gave him tools and wood and showed him how to measure and cut and join pieces together. Slowly, over weeks and months, he learned. He built a small table first, wobbly and rough, then a chair, then a bookshelf that actually looked good, that he felt proud of when it was finished. An Australian officer came by one day, examined the bookshelf, ran his hand over the smooth wood and nodded with approval. "Good work," he said through a translator. "Very good work." The Japanese officer felt something strange and unfamiliar rise in his chest. Pride. Not the hollow pride of rank and position and looking down on others, but real pride in something he had made with his own hands. In Japan, he had been taught that disabled soldiers were shameful. Men without legs or arms were hidden away, kept out of sight, treated as embarrassing reminders of defeat. Families often refused to talk about sons who came home broken, as if they had died but inconveniently kept breathing. The officer had expected this treatment here, expected to be shoved in a corner and forgotten. Instead, the Australians gave him purpose. They treated him as a craftsman. They paid him for his work with cigarettes and small privileges, as if his labour had value, as if he had value. He sat in his wheelchair, running his hands over a piece of furniture he had built, and realised he had not felt this useful, this human, since before the war. One prisoner, a former school teacher who had been drafted and lost an arm at Guadalcanal, began keeping a diary. He wrote in it at night, his left hand slowly improving, his characters becoming steadier. One entry read, "I believed we fought for honor, but what is honor without kindness? What is strength without mercy?" The Australians have shown me that real power is not the power to destroy, but the power to heal. They could have let us die. They could have treated us with the same cruelty we were told to expect. Instead, they fed us and healed us and gave us dignity. I do not understand this. It breaks everything I was taught. If the enemy can be kind, what does that make us? Another prisoner wrote, "I was told that surrender was the same as death, that a captured soldier loses his soul and becomes nothing. But I am not dead. I am alive. My wounds are healing. I am learning to work again. I am being treated like a person." Perhaps the lie was not that surrender equals death. Perhaps the lie was that life without victory has no meaning. Perhaps meaning comes from somewhere else, somewhere deeper than flags and emperors and ideas of racial superiority. The blind soldier did not write because he could not see, but he thought these same thoughts as he lay in his bed at night. He thought about his mother and what she would say if she knew he was alive, if she knew he was well fed and cared for. Would she be glad? Or would she be ashamed that he had not died in battle? He thought about his training, the officer who had screamed that Americans and Australians would torture prisoners, would treat them worse than animals. That officer had either been lied to or had lied deliberately. Either way, the truth was here in this camp, in the food and medicine and artificial limbs, in the way guards spoke to prisoners like they were human beings instead of vermin. What the disabled prisoners were experiencing was not just physical healing, it was the collapse of a worldview. Everything they had built their lives around, every belief that had seemed solid and true, was revealed as hollow. The emperor was not a god. Japan was not superior. The enemy was not evil. These realizations did not come all at once in a flash of light. They came slowly, meal by meal, kindness by kindness, day by day, until one morning a prisoner woke up and realized he no longer believed what he used to believe, and he did not know what to believe instead. August 1946. The war was over. Japan had surrendered after 2 atomic bombs turned cities into shadows and ash, after fire bombings had burned Tokyo until the canals boiled, after every promise of victory had turned to dust. Now the prisoners were going home. The blind soldier stood on the deck of a transport ship, one hand gripping the rail, the other holding a wooden cane. An Australian guard had made that cane for him in the workshop, had carved it smooth and fitted it with a rubber tip, had pressed it into his hands the day before he left. "For the journey home, mate," the guard had said. The blind soldier had bowed deeply, had tried to find words to express what he felt, but the guard had just patted his shoulder and walked away. The cane was still in his hand now, solid and real, proof that what he had experienced was not a dream. Around him on the deck were other disabled prisoners heading home. The officer with the prosthetic legs, walking carefully but walking, something he never thought he would do again. The one-armed soldier who had learned to write with his left hand, clutching notebooks filled with his improving characters. Men with scars and missing pieces and new skills. Men who had left Japan as believers and were returning as something else. Something they did not have words for yet. The ship cut through the Pacific, passing islands where battles had been fought, where men on both sides had died believing they were right, believing their cause was just, believing the other side was less than human. When they reached Japan, the blind soldier could smell his homeland before he could hear it, or rather, he could smell what his homeland had become. Smoke and ash and something rotten underneath. The smell of a country that had been bombed until whole cities disappeared. Someone guided him down the gangplank, and his feet touched Japanese soil for the first time in 4 years. He waited for joy, for relief, for the feeling of coming home. Instead, he felt a weight settle on his chest, heavy and cold. Around him, people were crying, but not with happiness. He heard voices, thin and desperate, begging. Children's voices. "Please, mister, do you have food? Any food at all?" His hand tightened on the Australian cane. They took a train from the port to Tokyo, or what was left of Tokyo. The blind soldier could feel the train swaying, could hear the wheels clicking on the tracks, but he could also hear the silence from the other passengers. No one talked. No one laughed. The air in the train car felt heavy with exhaustion and defeat. Someone whispered that they were passing through areas where whole neighborhoods had burned, where nothing was left but rubble and a few concrete buildings standing like tombstones. Nearly 3 years into his captivity, something happened that would break whatever certainty remained. December 25th, 1944, Christmas. He thought about abundance and waste, about how the Australians had so much they could give it away to enemies, while Japan had so little that its own people were starving. When he reached his family's house, or where their house had been, he learned it was gone. Burned in a firebombing raid 2 years ago. His mother and sister had survived, were living in a shelter made from scraps of wood and metal, one room shared with 3 other families. His mother touched his face, crying, saying his name over and over. She had thought he was dead. The army had sent a notice saying he was missing, presumed killed in action. That was how they handled prisoners, how they erased the shame of men who had surrendered instead of dying. His sister, who had been 12 when he left, was 16 now, thin as a stick, her cheeks hollow. She stared at the wooden cane he carried, at the clothes he wore that were Australian issue, at the small bag of possessions he had brought back. "You were captured," she said quietly. Mother told her to be silent, but the words hung in the air anyway. That night, lying on a thin mat on the floor of the shelter, listening to other families breathing and coughing and crying in their sleep, the blind soldier understood the full weight of the contrast. In Australia, enemy prisoners slept on mattresses with pillows. Here in Japan, Japanese citizens slept on floors in bombed-out shelters. In Australia, enemy prisoners ate 680 grams of meat per week. Here, his family was rationed 100 grams of rice per person per day, supplemented with sweet potato vines and whatever could be scavenged. In Australia, disabled enemy soldiers received prosthetic limbs and job training. Here, disabled Japanese soldiers were begging on street corners, ignored by people too tired and hungry to care. The officer with the prosthetic legs returned to his family's estate to find it occupied by homeless families who had nowhere else to go. His father had died in the final months of the war. His mother barely recognized him. She looked at his artificial legs with horror, as if he had brought back something shameful, something that proved he had not died honorably. He tried to tell her about the Australians, about their kindness, about the workshop where they had made these legs. She turned away. "Better you had died," she said quietly. "Better that than this shame." He stood there in the ruins of his family home, surrounded by strangers living in his rooms, and realized he had more dignity as a prisoner in Australia than he had as a returned soldier in Japan. The one-armed soldier found his wife had remarried, believing him dead. She had 3 children now, one of them his, 2 belonging to her new husband. She cried when she saw him, but they were complicated tears, not simple joy. Where would he live? How would he work? He showed her his notebooks, his improved handwriting, the carpentry skills he had learned. The new husband looked at him with suspicion and pity mixed together. The soldier left that night, walked until he found a shelter for displaced veterans, lay down among men who mumbled in their sleep about battles and bombs and hunger. Years passed. The blind soldier married a woman who did not mind his disability, had 3 children who grew up hearing stories about a war their father could not see, but would never forget. One day, when his oldest son was 10, the boy asked him what the war was like. The blind soldier thought carefully before answering. "I learned more about honor in captivity than I ever did in battle," he said. The boy frowned, confused. "Were the Australians cruel to you, father?" The blind soldier shook his head. "No," he said quietly. "That is what I could not understand. They were kind." And that was the most dangerous weapon of all, because it made me question everything I had been taught about enemies and superiority and what it means to be strong. The officer, now elderly, gave an interview in 1980 to a journalist writing about the war. He sat in his small apartment, his Australian-made prosthetic legs, long since replaced, but still kept in a box in his closet. He told the journalist about the camp, about the workshop, about learning that he could still be useful even without his real legs. "We were taught that death was preferable to capture," he said. "We were taught that a soldier who surrenders loses his humanity. But in captivity, I learned to live again. The Australians did not take my dignity. They gave it back to me. They showed me that I was more than my legs, more than my rank, more than my country's propaganda. That is something no war can teach and no emperor can command. That is something that can only be given by one human being to another." The journalist asked what he thought young people should learn from his experience. The officer looked out his window at Tokyo, rebuilt and prosperous now, full of cars and lights and people who had never known hunger. He thought about the contrast, about how far Japan had fallen and how far it had risen. He thought about the blind soldier and the one-armed soldier and all the other disabled men who had come home carrying more than just scars. "Learn this," he said finally. "The true measure of a nation is not how it treats its victors, it is how it treats the defeated, the broken, the ones who have nothing left to give. The Australians measured well, we did not. That is the lesson. That is what the war taught me. Not that we lost, but why we deserved to lose. Because we had forgotten how to be human to anyone we considered beneath us, and in the end, that made us the barbarians we accused others of being."